Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Molly Hudash.
Welcome back to another super episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. Today, we're going to be continuing our discussion of the different sections of the MCAT. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about cars. Last week, we talked about the Chem Phys section. Today, we're going to be talking about the bio section. I know our special guest, Molly, she's honestly been chomping at the bit. Like, I can't wait till we talk about bio tomorrow. I can't wait till we talk about bio later today. And so I'm excited for this episode, mostly just because of how excited you are, and how much insight we can give to students and help them out here.
Oh, totally. For anyone that has not met me before, my name is Molly Hudash. Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Phil, especially for today. If you are in the course, you probably know me. I do all the biochem office hours. This is my favorite content to talk about. I do love every part of the MCAT, but I love the content covered, but I also love the way that it's covered. And we're going to talk all about that here today, right? What sort of unique challenges are posed by this biochem section, and really what steps you can take to prepare yourself for this so that you can have the same excitement and joy whenever you talk about biochem that we do. That's our goal. Yeah. So first, right, we should probably talk about what kind of subjects and content that you'll actually see in biochem. Seems like a good place to start, huh, Phil? Yeah. So in biochem, right, like the name suggests, you're going to see mostly biology and biochemistry, right? This isn't like chemistry and physics, where you will also see a fair amount of biochem and even bio. So you're going to see like 65% will be bio, right? About 25% will be biochemistry. And then you'll see about 10% combined of Gen Chem and OChem, about 5% each, right? So really, you're going to get a lot of biology. You're going to get a lot of biochemistry. And while a lot of this stuff you've seen in undergrad, this experience of biology and biochemistry on the MCAT is going to be pretty different from how you've experienced these subjects before.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit tricky here. And there are some things that are kind of special. Like, the whole idea of this is we wanted to create podcasts to help out students if they were struggling with a specific section. So if you're struggling with specifically the bio section, we can give some insight and some clues on maybe how to work on that. But you're right, the bio content is all over the place. And so if somebody's just bad at bio content, they don't know what the mitochondria is, everyone knows it's the powerhouse of the cell. Yep. But if you don't know what that is, that's not just going to hurt you in bio. It'll probably hurt you most in the bio section, but it'll also hurt in Chem Phys, and it'll also hurt in Psych Soc, which we're going to talk about later on. But there are other challenges to the biochem section other than just straight content stuff. And I know that we've talked a fair amount of this about this, Molly, but often when I meet a student and they're just kind of starting, and I ask okay, what areas do you feel most confident in? What areas do you feel least confident in? Just trying to get an idea of how a student kind of feels about the test. I would say the vast majority of the time students are well, I'm comfortable with bio and I'm really good at bio. And this creates this really interesting scenario. I know I talk about this probably more than I should, but I'm so old that it actually is always in my head. I remember what the MCAT was like before. But when the MCAT changed in 2015, the big they really turned up the difficulty a lot because they had trouble differentiating students, had trouble telling who's actually going to do well in med school, because everyone's doing phenomenally on the old test. And so the new test is much more difficult. But if you think about it, if they really want to separate students, when it comes to the areas that most students are good at, they have to ramp that up even more than they would have to ramp up the difficulty of other sections. So I think in some ways, the biochem section and the biochem content might be one of the most like complex in the way that it is applied and the way that the difficulty has been shifted around this. So I think that there's a lot of students who come into the MCAT thinking, I'm really good at bio and I really hate orgo. And so I need to spend all my time on orgo. And honestly, it's very often the flip of that. Not only is bio way higher yield, but the way that you're being tested is probably much more complex than what you're used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why I giggled a second ago when you said that is because that is absolutely me. I already outed myself on the podcast a couple weeks ago with the Zai talking about study plans, but yeah, absolutely. I came out, I was a bio major, right? Huge bio nerd. I've actually loved biology. Weird story from shark biology since I was a little kid, right? Always loved it. Live, love biology. I came thinking, okay, cool, right? I'm really weak in orgo. That's going to be my biggest thing in physics, right? And I took the test and I was like, oh, shoot, right? These bio questions, it's not just, hey, yeah, which of the following is the powerhouse of the cell, right? It's like the most complex, right? Scary way that you could really see it. And believe it or not, that's actually why it's my favorite subject to this day, because the section will, right, it covers a consistent scope of content, right? But the way that they test it is so creative, right? They really, really ask you to understand and apply this knowledge in a way that I think is probably more intense than the other sections. Again, because many students, given that they're interested in human biology, human anatomy, physiology, abnormal physiology, right? They want to go into medicine. Usually they share a common interest, at least in bio, right? Some people also love chem phys, some people also love psych soc, but it feels like most people, they like bio at least a little bit. And I think that, combining the fact that there is so much content to be covered, right? And the fact that a lot of you have seen at least a fair amount of it, right? They really do delve into that difficulty in a couple different key ways. But even just considering the content, there are certain hoops that you've got to jump through to make sure that you retain it, since there's so much that you could see in those sections. Yeah,
this is why in the course, when it comes to the hard sciences, we spend more time in bio than anywhere else, because one, yes, it is higher yield. And so obviously you should spend more time on talking about things that are the highest yield. But also if you just kind of do your prereqs and you've got cell bio and you've got gen bio, that is not going to cover it when it comes to the types of questions and the difficulty that you're going to be seeing on test day. And there is it's not just the way things are tested, but also the actual content that's being covered. There are a lot of things, a whole lot of things that show up on the MCAT that I had never seen. I was a biology major, right? But I didn't taking the MCAT all of a sudden, I have never seen this nomenclature for mutations. I have never heard of these diseases that all of a sudden the MCAT wants me to know about prion diseases, right? I wasn't in a course where they talked about that. Anatomy and physiology. I didn't take anatomy and physiology. I took a lot of ecology courses because my biology thing kind of focused on that. That was a mistake, by the way. I'll talk about that here a little bit more in a minute, but I think that if you get the chance to take some higher level bio courses, it will make the MCAT easier, which is reason enough to do it. But especially things like anatomy and physiology, I really recommend students, even if you can't take it before your MCAT, you should if you can. But if you can't take it before your MCAT, it's still useful to take before you go to med school. I remember my first day of med school where it's 8:00 in the morning. I walk in and it's anatomy. It's dissection. And so day one, I've been in med school for 2 minutes. They hand me a scalpel, point to a cadaver and say, make a 4-inch incision, caudal to T4. And I'm I have no idea what you're talking about. And so getting some of that anatomy and physiology background, yes, will help you on the MCAT a lot, but it'll also help you in med school. My advisor told me my advisor gave me some bad advice when I was an undergrad. I'm like, should I take anatomy and physiology, or should I take should I take something else? And they're like, well, you have to take anatomy in med school, so you might as well take like ecology or something that you think will be fun. And like we caught grasshoppers, and it was fun, but it did not help me, and I was kicking myself later on. So that's one piece of advice I'd give students if you get a chance to take some of those higher level bio courses. That will make you do better on the MCAT, and it will help you in med school as well.
True. Although I do have to say, for those of us watching, I've got a jungle in my background. I alluded to this. I was obsessed with shark biology for like the first 20 years of my life. I actually switched into being interested in medicine way later than most of you guys listening, but loved biology, loved ecology too, right? And then became fascinated with, right, how the human body works. And also one of my favorite ways to think of the human body is full of its own ecosystems, right? The fact that ultimately your body houses ecology. So I agree. Ecology is not really on the MCAT. You're not really going to see any of that. But if you take a couple courses that just make you think, sometimes you'll find ways to conceptualize what you're learning in really unique ways. And that, right, conceptualizing is so important. It's so key, right? Especially when you're facing, a wall of knowledge that you need to suddenly shove in your brain, right? Telling yourselves stories, finding ways to explain things in a way that makes sense, and that connects with, the different coursework that you've done in the past or your personal interests. If anyone out there also loves sharks, let us know in the comments. There's not enough of us out there, right? But the stories that we tell ourselves to help us understand the content that we're trying to shove into our brain, to me, is one of the most important skills to build if you want to succeed in the biochem section. And Phil, I know you've got a bunch of stories. I also tell stories in biochem office hours all the time to help students remember and actually understand all the things that go on, every millisecond within our bodies. Yeah.
Those like sorts of analogies and metaphors, and like as you start to understand things and see things from different angles, this is something that happens, I feel like, in science, or in maybe just in education in general, that the farther you go, the more the lines get blurred, right? When you go really deep into biology, like as far as like pushing the boundaries of biology, like there's a lot of chemistry in there. There's a lot of physics in there about like understanding charges on different enzymes, maybe causing attractive forces. That's electrostatics. And like that explains how an enzyme is able to bind a substrate. And like that's physics more than anything. And so there are some things that I think, like if you get a chance, I know I said anatomy and physiology, but there's also some other things that like, there's some really high level bio stuff, and most high level bio courses you're going to take are going to help. But there, even beyond that, there's a couple, especially neuro. And I'm not saying that just because I love neuro, but neuro obviously is biology, but neuro also crosses over so much into psychology. And so there's a lot of neuro questions in the psychology section. We're going to talk about psych later, but there's bio in that section. Probably not kidney questions, right? It's probably not about like evolution. It's probably about like neuro side of things. And you also see neuro in physics with like voltages and circuits and kind of relationships there. And so I think of all like the anatomical and like anatomy and physiology systems looking at, I think neuro is the highest yield for the MCAT. And so if you get a chance to take a high level neuro course, I think that can help you kind of across the board. I think virology, like anything with a lot of journal reviews where you can learn about a lot of lab techniques, I think can be really useful, because there are some things on the MCAT that I didn't even know existed before I started prepping for the MCAT.
Yeah. And I love that you bring up lab techniques, because one, they are incredibly high yield, right? And you can see these not just tested in questions, but also presented in passages, right? All throughout the MCAT. And two, because some of the most intimidating passages for many, many, many students, myself included when I was first starting, are the experimentally based passages, because they're going to, right, present some question that they have, right? And then they're going to get into some really chunky methods, right? Where they're going to drown you in all of these seemingly scary lab techniques, right? They'll present data that you have to interpret, right? It's a lot, right? And being familiar with lab techniques, and especially having done them yourself, can help so much. Like I remember still, I teach separation techniques sometimes as a free class that you guys can find on the website. And I've also taught this in so many workshops as part of the course, right? Every time that I talk about chromatography, right, I'm thinking back to when I would actually do that in OChem lab, or extractions, like acid-base extractions, right? Mm-hmm. All of these things are so familiar to me and so ingrained in my, memory, because I actually did them. I actually carried them out. I had to figure out which reagents to use and things like that because, physically I was involved in that process. And it can help you understand what's going on in these complex research-based passages quite a bit.
Yeah. And not only that, if you get a chance to do research, I know a lot of students, like you want to get some research time on your application. It may be good to, and I don't know if I would generally recommend this other than just like, it kind of helps with the MCAT. Like if you did rotations in 3 or 4 different labs, like you might learn lots of different techniques. And that's a really useful thing. There are some things that I've seen on the MCAT that were things that like, I only knew this answer because I've done these sorts of experiments before. Like I've had to find restriction enzyme cutting sites in a big, like I have a page of printout of just like sequence, because I sequenced DNA and I got to find some places to cut in this. And so finding palindromic sequences, that's only because I had done that I was able to answer those questions on the MCAT, or like what primer is going to be best at binding or things like that.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this and saying, oh my God, I don't have a ton of research experience, I'm not going to succeed on the MCAT, I want you to just take a second, take a deep breath, and know that Phil teaches the complete MCAT course. So if you're like, shoot, right, this sounds really intense, right? If we're starting to make you nervous, right, know that you can not only just take the course, but you could also go try it if you want to see, right? Because the best part about having someone so passionate and excited about the MCAT with such a wealth of experiences in their lives is that they could take all those things and distill it into bite-sized pieces for you, so that you'll never feel like, oh my God, I've never heard of this because I didn't take that weird lab option in undergrad, right? Because, right, you're learning from people who have done all those weird things and recognize their value, and they can distill it for you. Just a little plug, since Phil, I know you have so much knowledge there to share.
Yeah. In the course, it's kind of interesting. I think like more than any other single content area like endocrine system or neurology, I think we spend more time on analytic techniques because that's such a big problem for students, and there's so many. I think just covering content of analytic techniques, there's 4 hours of just dedicated to that. And then I also talk about analytic techniques in like interspersed in other lessons. And then, there's a lesson on data interpretation. And so there's a lot to go from there. But I do like this analytic technique stuff is so critical. And something that is very important here is you don't just need to have memorized affinity chromatography does this, and gas liquid chromatography does this, and size exclusion does this. You need to understand how they work, so that you can start to apply this to other scenarios, because the MCAT loves curveballs. Like they're constantly throwing curveballs. They're constantly throwing stuff at you with new techniques that they know you've never heard of. But like when you start to read it, you're like, oh, this is the way that they're explaining this. This seems kind of similar to this technique that I do understand how that works. And so it turns out it's related to that. And I don't think I can overemphasize how often that happens on the MCAT. If you look at the AAMC's materials, there's passages on circular dichroism chromatography. There's passages on photoacoustic calorimetry and matrix-assisted laser desorption ionization. All of those techniques are things that you're not supposed to understand and have memorized and know about. But when they start to talk about them a little bit in the passage, you need to be like, oh, oh, this is kind of like this other thing. And so you don't just want to memorize like Western blots for proteins. Like you do need to know that, but like you need to understand. Yeah, it's snowdrop. It's southern, northern, western. Is DNA, RNA, protein. It's one of my favorite mnemonics. Just
those are just smiley faces.
Yeah. Side note: if you want some other mnemonics, we did a podcast I think back over the summer going through our favorite mnemonics, and snowdrop was definitely on that list. But yeah, this is the sort of thing of like understanding like how does this work? How does an extraction work, right? Because the MCAT's not going to do like a really straightforward, like, oh, here's a hydrophobic thing, here's a hydrophilic thing. We do an extraction, right? Like they're going to amp up the difficulty and twist this around. And so like the things are going to be changing from polar to non-polar and back and forth in response to acids and bases that you're adding to this. And so all of a sudden, like this question, like in order to answer this question, you have to understand amino acids, you have to understand acids and bases and titrations, and you have to understand like conceptually how do extractions work. So you can put all those pieces together. And that's hard. I'm just gonna like start now that is a hard thing that they're asking you to do. And it takes some time and effort. And so even if you are feeling confident in bio, you probably want to spend some time working on this. I've had maybe like one or two students who like, you know, like I'm talking to the student, I'm like tutoring them or something, and like talking to them like, oh, they just finished up their master's degree in biochemistry at Oxford. And I'm like, okay, and you've done lab research for a decade. We probably don't need to go into that in that case. Pretty much everyone else, like it's worth going into, and I think everyone struggles with it.
Yeah. And even in that case that you mentioned, right, that someone just got their master's in biochem, right? They've been doing lab work for decades, right? Even the way that MCAT passages will present information is so unique. Like even if you have been doing research for X amount of years, right? You know the content backwards and forwards. To me, and again, part of the reason why I absolutely adore biochem and I'll never get tired of it is because you almost have to adopt the persona of like a detective while going through these passages, right? Because they, like you said, are going to present so much information, so much jargon, so many techniques that you've never heard before. Know that they know you've never heard of it. You know, they're not expecting you to just have it memorized, which I could go off on a side tangent here about how important it is to recognize when a question is asking you about a content thing you should know versus a passage, but it actually ties in. So I'll rant throughout this discussion, right? Yeah. You need to train yourself as you're reading to say, okay, I have no idea what's going on here, but like they're using a ton of terms I don't recognize, but I do feel a similarity or relationship to this content thing that I do know, right? It's reminding me of this, or I see this term, I see kinase, and I know that it means adiphosphate. I know, you know, that this is an enzyme that has a particular function that may, alter particular amino acid sequences in a protein, right? Like you need to be making connections with what you do know while you're dealing with things that on the surface have nothing to do with what you studied, right? And that it's very unnerving, right? And I imagine it would be for anybody. But to me, accepting that you are not supposed to know every single word that they throw at you in a bio passage, it's almost empowering because it then opens the door for critical thinking skills, right? Okay, how can I use what I do know to unpack this thing that I don't know? And that, again, another crucial skill. But it comes with a mindset shift in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like just having the frame of reference where they're talking about this technique you've never heard of, but they mentioned spectroscopy and you're like, okay, this is going to involve light somehow. And like, that might just get you the answer on test day. And like, are you supposed to understand exactly how this machine works? And maybe not, right? They could ask you some questions if they feed you enough information that you can start to connect things, that's something they absolutely can. And I want to kind of take a moment here because I want to kind of shine a light on something, and that like some of what we're talking about, it sounds unfair, and it kind of is. I do think that there is a level to this that is a little bit unfair for you students who are prepping for the MCAT, where like you do all your prereqs, and even then the MCAT is testing you at this level of data interpretation and journal reading and understanding of all these techniques that no undergrad student has ever covered all of these things. But now all of a sudden you're expected to be a master of this. And I think a lot of times students get really frustrated with that. And I think that they are not necessarily in the wrong to be kind of frustrated, like why where did this come from? But I want to kind of take a second on like putting stuff in context, because that always helps kind of understand this as well. As a physician, you will have to do tons of like data interpretation and research. You're not done like learning about stuff the moment you graduate, because medicine changes. Like people learn more about different treatments and different diseases. I remember when I was in med school and a cure for hepatitis C came out, and every physician I knew was reading up about this and reading up about the trials and what's going on with that. I still get together with my friends from med school. I try to get together with them on Zoom at least once a week. And very often, like we're always just kind of talking about like what's going on in each other's lives and joking around, but like inevitably always somebody will bring up something like, hey, did you read that article about COVID exposure to pregnant mothers, like specifically in that like the third trimester? And somebody like, no, I didn't read that. Can you send that to me? Because like I actually have a patient I think that may apply to. And so like this sort of thing of like this data interpretation, understanding these complex journal articles and these experimental techniques is something that physicians do need to know. And they don't. And so some of you guys are probably thinking like they should teach us this in med school. I promise you, when you're in med school, you will not say they should be teaching me more, right? Like, cause you're full. There's no time to add more teaching on top of this. And so this is something that you do have to know as a physician. You got to be a master of it. And you don't have time to learn about it in med school, and they don't teach it to you in undergrad. So where does this fall in this journey? And so I think that's why the AMC is so heavily pressuring this data interpretation side and analytic technique side, is because they need to know that our physicians can handle this, and they know that you're not going to have time to like master this while you're in med school. And so they kind of push the buck to a little bit earlier in the process. And so I think so those of you who are feeling like this is like, why are they asking me these crazy, difficult, complex, like analytic data interpretation questions? Know that like, yeah, it kind of sucks, but like it's got to be at some point in this process. And this is where the AAMC was like, okay, we'll just put it here because we need to make sure that they can handle this.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're very right in saying that the biochem section has some really tough data to interpret in a lot of ways. And part of me agrees, it is unfair. All of me agrees that, wow, it would be great to have some sort of guidance and structure where you're actually taught, this is how you should read a paper. This is how you should read a passage. This is how you should break down a figure of this type, right? To have that intrinsically taught to you would be amazing. And I agree. I wish it kind of was in undergrad. But it also presents this fascinating challenge of how can I learn how to not just understand what is being presented here, but also to do it with time pressure. It really tests your limits as a learner. And I always try and analyze the way that my implicit feelings about the MCAT so that I can understand, right, my perspective and how I can shift it, right? And to me, right, like at the beginning, I was so frustrated at how unfair it was. But ultimately, like you said, they're not going to have time to teach you this directly in med school. So it's almost like this is a skill that you hadn't been taught in the past that you will need, right? And they're almost putting this hurdle up for you to make sure that you're prepared for what comes after, right? So it is very intentional with the placement. That being said, it's tough. Yeah, it's tough to learn. And part of me is glad that they present arguably the toughest data interpretation questions and passages in the bio section, because like we've said, students are most often the most comfortable with biology and biochemistry. Like I challenge you guys to imagine if you are someone who's scared of physics and OChem, how much scarier this would be to have that complex of a passage in that section. That being said, right, there are definitely strategies that you can use to unpack research figures. And if you are feeling like, you're feeling lost because this was never taught to you, know that we have these science strategies. We have an acronym that you might find useful. It's taught, right? Title, axes, units, trends. It's just meant to guide you, give you a frame of reference to, okay, here's this really scary figure. What the heck am I supposed to do with this, right? Do I panic? Do I spend 10 minutes just staring at it? Do I completely gloss over it and skip it, right? Most of us will react in one of those two ways, right? But it's not taught. There's no silent P like pterodactyl, right? It's taught, title, axes, units, trends, right? It's just to give you, okay, this is scaring me, but I know I will always start here. Then I'll look at this, then I'll look at this, and then I'll expect myself to understand rather than just looking at it and saying, I should know what information is presented, what the important findings are, right? That a system that can feel debilitating, right? So anytime you could systemize your approach, that's what we want to do, right? That's what we do in our strategy lectures for sure.
Yeah. And I know like some of the things that makes this difficult with the data is, there's a lot of data. I know there's one passage from the AAMC that in order, like in their practice materials they've released, like in order to finish this passage, like, and all the questions and the answers and read through the passage, you have to look at like 11 graphs, like in order to finish this passage. Now, some of them are in the questions, but like still like the idea of like to finish this passage, you have to interpret 11 different like graphs or tables going through this, like that's challenging. And so you need to be able to do this, not just when it's really complex, but also like you need to be able to do it quickly. And so having this strategy of like, okay, I'm looking for the title. And I know that sounds silly, like of course look at the title, but a lot of times students so focus on the data that they don't pay attention to like the explanation. And there are answers hidden in those sometimes, or at least like a piece of information that you need in order to answer a question. So the students who just look at the table and the graph and don't look at the like explanation, you'll miss a question because of it. The axes are big, like make sure you know exactly what's being measured and how it's being measured. Like, are they measuring the protein or are they measuring the RNA that codes for the protein, right? Like what are they, or are they measuring functional protein, right? Like all of those are slightly different. And you got to be really careful with that. Units, obviously big, right? Like if you're doing any sort of calculation, like you need to know, are you dealing with micromolar or nanomolar? And that's often how the MCAT will like add a layer of difficulty to a question. And we'll talk more about that here in a second, but to finish up the acronym TAUT, titles, axes, units, trends is the last one. And that's where the MCAT wants to, like, they want to start to ask you application questions. Like, so in this experiment, they've shown like what happens in hamsters when you remove their pituitary. Now there's a question of what happens if you give a hamster an extra pituitary, right? Like that's not in the table, but if you understand, like, okay, when you remove the pituitary, it goes this way, or this shrinks or grows, and like this will do the opposite of that. And so you have to have those trends down really well. And so those are the things that they like to, kind of like sprinkle into this.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, whenever I'm teaching taught in classes, sometimes students are like, well, can I just do trends? Like, I'll ask them, like, of the 4 letters, which one do you think is most frequently tested? And of course it's trends. Of course, you're going to get a lot of questions that are like, which of the following statements is true of the data presented in figure 1, right? Or like, which of the following is a potential finding from this experiment, right? Like, they have a lot of those questions, and those tend to be really tricky, right? So a lot of students are like, I'm already pressed for time. I know I'm going to get these tricky questions that are all based on trends. Why do I need the TAW in taught, right? Can't I just go for the last T? But really the point there is to give you all the clues and information that you need to understand the trends, right? So it's almost like that's the X on the map, right? Like that's where you want to get, but we've got to take a journey to get there. And like you said, Phil, along the way, along that journey, you may get really crucial pieces of information, right? Especially, in the title, you may see information about statistical significance. That's very important. If you see that asterisk, p-value of less than 0.05, it's like a huge flag. Please pay attention to me. I'm the most important thing in this figure. I'm right here. Look at me, right? That's necessary for those trends, because that is, going to tell you which statements you can make and which ones you can't make, right? Or sometimes they'll give you, they may be operationalizing a particular variable, right? They may tell you in the title, hey, we're looking for retinol uptake, right? But in the figure, it says, something totally different, right? Maybe it's retinol fluorescence. And you're like, fluorescence, like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean if fluorescence is high? Like the passage is about this, the title bridges that, right? It's telling you, this is what we're really looking at, even though that axis says something different. So it's like, there are so many things that if you just try and skip to go to the data, it's not going to be possible, because the questions, even though retinol fluorescence could be on the y-axis, all the questions in that, or all the answer choices in that question, they're all about uptake. And you're like, I don't even know where to look.
Yeah.
Right. So, and making sure you have all the info before you get to the questions is crucial.
Yeah. And that goes to this like context. And I think that this is also like, not only does the MCAT just give all this tricky information, and like, we say they're going to give you a bunch of data, but like, it's not going to be something where they give you like here's a table of exactly how many McDonald's are in each state. And then they ask you a question like, how many McDonald's are in Idaho? And you just go and you like put that answer down. Like that's way too straightforward. And like, obviously, like you could even do the same thing with like, these different organisms, who's got the highest levels of MyoD1, which is a protein that helps cause muscle growth. And so like, and then they just give you this table, and then they ask you like, which one has the highest MyoD1. That's not going to be a question. The MCAT in this effort to ratchet up the difficulty, right? They aren't going to ask a bunch of stuff that they know it's impossible for you to know, but what they're going to do instead is they're going to have questions that require multiple steps in order for you to answer this. Like they're going to ask, like, in order to answer this question, you're going to need to look at this table of like the different links of these different fatty acids. And you're also going to need to look at this table that shows something about like cancer rates in response to this like protein, like this that's involved in beta oxidation. And then you're also going to need to look at like this number that's in the passage. And then there's another number in the explanation for the figure. And you need all of those things to answer the question. And you got to put all those little pieces together. And this is what makes it so difficult, is like, not only are the tables complex, and very often they're I wish it was like simple tables, like this table is just testing one variable. Here's with the thing, here's without it. Like, no, it's like, okay, we have 4 different variants, and then we're trying this with this drug that we think stimulates it, and we're trying it all with the one that inhibits it, and then we're trying it with some other drug that we think might be similar. And so there's like 5 different variables that are all being changed all at the same time. You got to be able to look at that and figure out like, okay, right, like for the longest lived mouse, you need this mutation, but you need this thing to be missing, and you need this thing to be present. And then in the passage, they say like something is an inhibitor of that thing, and you got to catch that too. And so it's a lot of juggling of small pieces and making sure you can put it together. It's not just straight like, look at this table. But that's why it's important to like look at the axes, look at the trends, look at the units, right? Because there are things in there that you're going to need a piece of this in order to actually answer the question.
Totally. And I think that this demonstrates how crucial it is to really slow down while you're reading. So many of us feel all this pressure, especially if you're doing a full length, right? Not only do you have time pressure, but you also have endurance pressure, right? You've got to go through chem phys and cars, and then it's biochem, right? Maybe you're fresh from lunch, maybe you're not, maybe you're tired, right? Like so many things that can make you nervous and make you want to speed up. But for biochem especially, although this is true of everything, you got to approach it with intention. Again, you're reading a sentence and saying, okay, there's these new things, but I'm thinking about this, and like I need to be tracking, not memorizing, right? The passage is still there if you need to refer back to it, but tracking what ideas are mentioned and where they're mentioned, so that when you get a question that requires so many different pieces of the passage, that at the very least you know where to look for it, right? And you may think, oh, in order for them to ask this question, like, I know I must have these 3 pieces of info. Where is that in the passage, right? You'll actually save a lot of time if you can slow down as you read, because you won't need to go reread the passage searching for these clues every time, right? And they may not be direct, they may not be easy to find, but this is where practice comes in. This is one tip that I bet you guys have talked about in the past. I may have even mentioned it when I was doing the How to Study podcast a couple weeks ago, but something that has really helped me with biochem especially, but all the test section is when you review, go back. If you highlight, right, clear fresh screen, little plug for the Chrome extension, you can hit review with Jack Westin and it'll pop up just like a brand new test in the AMC interface, right? But look at each question as you review. What clues were in the passage that you needed to answer this question, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, I actually will go back and highlight them after the fact and say, okay, in this passage, I needed to pick this, and this up. Like those were the most crucial. Pretty much all the questions revolved around these pieces of information, right? Why was I supposed to pick up on those? Why were they important?
Clues?
What were the clues, right? Like how was the AMC hoping that I was going to read this passage, right? And that is so critical, even though it's seemingly pretty simple, right? An extra little, maybe 10 seconds per question as you're reviewing, but it can really help you look for those clues as you do more and more practice.
Yeah, this is a really big deal. So I just want to pause and reemphasize this just in case anybody missed it, because it is really important. When you're reviewing, don't just review the questions. Don't just go back and reread the passage. Yes, do those things, but also at the end, look at all the questions in the passage together. I know we talk about this a lot in the course, but this is useful for anyone listening. Look at the questions and look at the passage and what things did they ask about, and then find what were the clues that's what I should have been focusing on and paying attention to. And I want to be kind of clear here that you're not going to see this passage again. You're not going to see a passage that's even really, really, really similar to this, right? But the way that the AAMC emphasizes things tends to be pretty consistent. If they ever mention, if they mention just in passing an amino acid, there's going to be a question on it. That should be screaming, that's the most important thing, right? Literally any amino acid that is mentioned, there's going to be a question. And so alarm bells should go off whenever you read oh, we noticed this was a serine kinase. And you're oh, this question is about serine. One of these things is going to be about serine at some point. And that's useful in understanding how to tackle and pull the passages apart. And I want to kind of reiterate, once again, stepping back, the whole point of these podcasts, this series, is we want to talk about what to do if you really are struggling with just one section, right? So note that with Chem Phys last week, we talked about how doing practice questions helps you understand context of when this thing applies and when that thing applies. And I think that's more important in chemistry and physics than it is any other section. In bio, because data interpretation tends to be the problem that most students run up against, I think in that section, more than any of the other science sections, it's more important to do lots of practice passages. So you should be structuring your study where you're doing more passages when you're prepping bio than you maybe are for the other sections. And you're maybe doing more discrete questions in Chem Phys than you are in the other ones. And so it's really important to just kind of think about what are the challenges that we're running up against and how should that be structuring and changing the way that we're learning and the way that we're studying. And I think that's a really critical thing to kind of understand, where am I going to run into challenges and how do I work on those specifically, which is how you should approach everything in general is my thought process.
Yes. Always collect data on yourself. Always don't just, take one diagnostic exam at the beginning and say, oh, okay, these are my strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to spend the next 6 months targeting how I performed on this one day, right? Mm-hmm. Constantly evaluate yourself. The way that I like to phrase it is treat yourself like a research paper, right? Treat yourself like an MCAT passage, present your methods of analyzing yourself, right? Track your data, right? Make sure that you are constantly revisiting and reestablishing your strengths and weaknesses so you can target them most effectively. And I agree that data interpretation is probably the biggest unique challenge to biochem, although I do think that there's a second one that is more prevalent and more concerning in biochem than the others, and that's jargon.
Yeah.
It is. It really is, because they know you're comfortable with it and they need to test you, right? So they're going to present so many new proteins, enzymes, molecules, inhibitors, right? They almost drown you in it in certain passages, right? Yeah. Sometimes they'll do this in conjunction with an experiment, and those are gnarly. Oftentimes they'll have different styles of passages. Some are really jargony, some are really experimental, right? But that is another incredibly tricky thing to balance, right? Let's say you have a passage that's presenting a signaling cascade that you've never heard of, right? They're giving you this molecule activates this one through phosphorylation, and that one then goes and cleaves this molecule, which then has two different downstream effects and inhibiting this and turning on this, and these each have different effects. It's a lot to juggle, right? And one concern that I have is sometimes, you'll get a question that asks about some intimate piece of that pathway, and students see that they have a question asking specifically about the function of one of those intermediates, and they say, oh my gosh, I should have known that. That's a molecule that's in the biochem passage. I should have known that. That's a content issue. I'm going to go hammer that whole pathway home. No, yeah. Right. This is why it's important to look back. Where were the clues? Because it's so tempting when you're buried in jargon to say, they're acting like I should have recognized this molecule and known something crucial about it. I think it's a pseudo discrete question. It's not. Right. And one of the ways that we talk about in the course a lot, right, and that we'll offer up as a tip, is use that scratch paper. Use it, please. Right? Please use it to help you, whether it's, however you can use it under time conditions that will benefit you, go for it. Personally, I love drawing pictures. I love drawing maps, diagrams, right, outlining relationships. I don't really take notes with it, but I do absolutely draw. Because it's much easier if you get a question about some molecule that's in the smack dab middle of a pathway. And sometimes it's not, what does it do? It's what would happen to the pathway if we removed it, or if we mutated that gene, or if we introduced an inhibitor of that, right?
Right.
How would this whole pathway fall apart? And if you're trying to juggle with the whole passage again, and you had a lot of trouble reading through that passage in the first place, it's going to be impossible, right? But if you struggle with that passage and you try to almost translate it into a drawing, then you're looking at your drawing and saying, what if I covered this up? Okay, this downstream effect would be canceled. This would not be turned on. Then it becomes easy, right? Yeah. Use that scratch paper, you guys. It's so helpful in those scenarios.
Yeah. And those passages, I always call those passages avalanches of jargon.
Yep.
And I want to be, just giving an example, this is an actual pathway that I have seen tested where FAS is a receptor and there's a ligand that binds it that activates FAD, which can activate caspase 8, which causes apoptosis. But CFLIP is a structural homologue lacking the catalytic activity of caspase 8. But that thing leads to ERK1 and ERK2, which are transcription factors, which then those things lead to, and all of this stuff when you're reading this over the course of passages. And then what happens is 3 paragraphs later, you come across something where they say oh, and that we added this drug, which we knew as an inhibitor of caspase 8, but it didn't affect CFLIP. And you're I don't remember what any of those things are. And so with those passages that are this avalanche of jargon, I feel sometimes like a 5-year-old because I want to look at the passage and no, I want picture. Give me a picture of don't give me words. I want pictures, right? And so I look at this and so it does not take much as you're reading to write FAS, arrow, FAD, and then arrow, or caspase 8, and then arrow, apoptosis. And then arrow from FAD down to CFLIP, and then arrow to no apoptosis. And all of a sudden, as you start, you just do this quick sketch, which takes you maybe 10 seconds, as you're writing this out, all of a sudden you get those questions of what if we inhibit the thing that inhibits CFLIP, and well, if that pathway doesn't work, the only other pathway is the one that leads to apoptosis. And you're okay, well, that's it. And that's way, way, way easier. I don't think students need to do those quick drawing and sketches for every passage, but especially those ones that are avalanche of jargon passages. I am really comfortable with biology. Like generally, like bio degree, going to med school, working in bio PhD, like I am still drawing that out because it's so much simpler for me to wrap my mind around, especially when the MCAT starts to throw those curveballs about like, what if we inhibit the thing that inhibits the thing that stimulates the thing that inhibits this? And you're like, I don't know. I need a picture for that.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I adore biology. I adore biochem. Like I could talk about it all day. But at the end of the day, I also want to set myself up for success. And, like if I needed to, if I didn't have a picture, I didn't have anything to draw, right? And I got a question like that, I could go parse through the passage and I could trust myself to go figure it out, but it would take me a while and I wouldn't have the same amount of confidence as I do if I have a picture in front of me that I've made to document my knowledge, right? It's so much easier. And I do get a lot of questions because, like I mentioned, I teach biology, biochemistry office hours every single week for our course students. I get a lot of submissions to our office hours like, hey, can you go over this passage? Like, I wasn't really sure. There were so many words in there, so many terms that was I supposed to know this? Like, how do I get these complex pathway-based or jargon-based questions right? So I do a lot of these little drawings, these little maps. And one of the questions that I often get is, when do you actually make those? Right? Some students have asked, like, do you make it like as you're reading? Do you read the whole thing and then draw it? Like, when are you supposed to do this? And Phil, I'm curious to your answer. Personally, I always draw it as I'm reading, right? Like I see something, I see a relationship, right? And I'm like, oh, cool. And I draw it, I write it down, and then I get more and I'm like, oh, cool. I can figure out where to put that on the figure because I look down and I already have it drawn, right? So it's like, I almost treat it as a translation, right? I'm reading something in another language and I'm translating it into something that makes sense to me that I can use later on.
Yeah. Like if this thing leads to this, I'll draw an arrow. If it doesn't lead to that, I'll draw an arrow with an X. And I'm like, I'm with you. This is something I would never tell a student to read it all and then try to draw it out because it gets too complex. Like the whole point here is that this is too hard to understand all of this without like some drawing simplifying it. Like I am not going to try to memorize it all and then try to draw it. Like just every time you come across this thing leads to this thing, like add it, FADD arrow, done. And then they talk about the next bit. And that's especially important because like I mentioned, like very often, like the different pieces aren't always in the same paragraph. Like sometimes they're spread all over the place. And that's something that makes it like even more difficult. And this is something done by the AAMC on purpose. They like turning up that dial on the difficulty bar. And so they'll introduce like, a drug that inhibits something. They'll introduce that later. And then they'll add something else a little bit later as well. And then there's a graph, but like the graph is and like it's related to the stuff up at the top, but it's been like 3 paragraphs and you've already looked at another graph. And like you need to understand how this stuff all fits together. And so you want to kind of just as you're doing and just add stuff to that drawing as you go. And I think that that's really important as well. And you're right, that is this like jargon problem is another like specific thing. I wasn't sure what you were going to say when you're like, there's another big problem that's really specific to bio. And then you said jargon. I'm like, oh. But like, once again, the way to work on that is do more passages. I think that there is a big layer here of you need exposure to these things. Like I said, it's a little unfair. I know, and the AMC even knows that you've never seen some like stuff like this. You've never been tested on stuff like this before. And so you need to be exposed to these things. Like if you are doing just bio and that's it, and you're just covering content, and then you do a passage, like the very first passage you're going to freak out because this is like, I thought I memorized everything that I need, but like I think the bio, perhaps more than the other sections, the science sections, has this level of critical thinking on top of the other things. And so that's something that you definitely need to be working on and like putting time specifically into this.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like we've brought up so many really important points in this discussion of biochem that are so unique to this section that I hope are really helpful to hear for those of you guys who are struggling with this section, right? So I feel like Phil, it would be good to sort of recap, right? If this section is the one that is making you want to tear your hair out, or right with frustration, or if this subject has become a symbol to you of, I thought I understood this, but I will never be good at the MCAT because this is my comfort zone and look at how poorly I'm doing, right? Just if you're in that zone, right? As a reminder, this is not just an undergrad biology, biochemistry test.
No.
It's so much more than your knowledge and honestly, even your understanding, right? To me, it's like, recall, recognition kind of as the foundation. You absolutely need that. In some sections, that's enough. In some content areas, that's enough, right? Then you kind of build on it and it's like understanding, like, could you define this and explain this to somebody else, right? Just the concept. And then cherry on top is the application and the synthesis, right? Taking knowledge that you have and using that to synthesize an expectation based on this knowledge that's foreign to you. It's really, really tricky, right? So if you are feeling like, I should know this, I should be having a 132 in this section, know that they are intentionally making this much more difficult. They're focusing on that top of the pyramid, right? You're going to see a lot of stuff that you've never seen. Use your scratch paper if you can to help you juggle all of that new information and cling to the stuff that you recognize, that you've studied, that you've seen in undergrad, right? The stuff that feels familiar. It's crucial to helping you understand the stuff that you don't, right? Yeah. If you see figures, make sure that you are breaking these down intentionally, right? Make sure that you're reviewing anytime you get lab techniques in a passage, right? Go Google it, right? Treat it like a fun little thought experiment. I wonder what the heck this thing actually does now that I'm done with it, right? Make sure that you are structuring your review to hit on all these important points.
Yeah, absolutely. This also hits another just general thing. Like, this is something that, as you were talking, like, this also relates to, like, you're never going to see the same passage again, but like on your actual test day, like it's never like a repeat of like the exact same passage. Like, but the more passages you see, like not just like from studying do you start to understand things, but like from, I've read a passage that was kind of like this or kind of similar to this. And that's why it's really important to review the passages, right? And how that relates. There's so many students that like when they do bio stuff, they do the passage, they do the questions, and then they just review the questions. And like some students just review the ones they missed and they just read the explanation. They just focus on that. They don't focus on like going back and making sure they understood how what the passage was about. I know that at the very beginning of MCAT prep, and honestly, probably halfway through, it also still feels this way, that the MCAT is asking this, there's a limitless amount of stuff that they could ask, and there's no boundaries or edges to this because it just seems like it keeps going forever. But if you prep really well and you review your passages as you're going, I promise you, like even if you just did the AAMC stuff and you did no other practice materials, you will start to see passages where you're like, I think I've seen something kind of like this before. It wasn't the exact same, but it was a little bit different. This TNF, they didn't tell me what TNF was, but I've actually seen two other passages on TNF, and that's tumor necrosis factor. That kills tumors. So that causes apoptosis. So like that information can kind of help me with this. And so even though like TNF is not something that is on like a list of terms you need to know, the more passages you do, the more stuff starts to fit together and the more the pieces start to fit. And so I think that like, once again, this is why in the bio section, this exposure is so important, because there's this stuff that they know you haven't seen. And the more you see, the easier the pieces kind of get together, and the easier it gets for you to understand like what are the things that actually matter in this passage and how do I identify those so that when I see a different passage, I can latch on to those things.
Totally. And in addition to like content that shows up again and again, that might give you clues on yield, it might help you unpack things. To be honest, I think that to me, I call them passage flavors, right? There are distinct structures of passages, right? Like
I've never heard that before, but I love it because you're right. That there are flavors.
call back to the very beginning of this video, right? Talking about the stories you tell yourself and the way that that can increase your retention. I always use weird words like that kind of mix senses where you're like, what? The passage flavor? You're not tasting these. At least you shouldn't be. Imagine on test day, you're like licking the screen. What passage flavor is this?
Don't do that.
You're probably going to get your test voided. They're probably going to investigate somehow. But you start to recognize like the flow of information, maybe the style of the passage. And I'll tell you this firsthand, right? When you sit down to take your test, anything that you can do to increase your familiarity with this experience of your real test is crucial, right? Studying in about the same, hour and a half blocks, right? Getting used to that endurance of pushing through and having your brain on for that long, right? Recognizing common themes in passages or common flavors of passages, right? You'll see it and you won't have that immediate fear of like, I've never seen this before. This is terrifying. I'm not going to be able to make my way through it, because you'll see it and you'll recognize things that remind you of your prep. Right. And again, comes back to do as many practice passages as you can. Right. But also look for the things that are consistent between them. Right. Because if you can recognize those on test day, it'll be a huge relief to you. Right. And really help curb those anxious responses to sitting down on test day. I know for me personally, that was really helpful.
Yeah. There's a useful thing in here and just kind of understanding how the MCAT writers build their tests. And I feel like we're going so long on this. There's so much to talk about with this, but know that the MCAT writers don't have people that they hire to write these passages. Like, these are real passages from other publications. And so what other people are studying and what other people are researching, like there are certain like areas in science that kind of go through like, this field is kind of hot right now. And like, this field is like, oh, like nobody kind of cares about this. We all think it's stupid now. But the last, like anything that like became particularly important in the last, like, I'd say 5 to 15 years, there tends to be a lot more articles on that. This is also why if you look at the exams from the AMC, there's a lot of cancer passages in there. And that's just because there's a lot of cancer research, right? There's so many people doing cancer research. And so you start to see kind of like similar topics, like maybe stem cell stuff shows up a little bit more. I don't feel like I haven't seen that much stem cell stuff from them, but maybe it has to do with like politics of it or something, but they don't want to make a mess. And so like there is definitely a lot of cancer stuff. There's also occasionally you'll start to see some more stuff on like viruses and virology. I think gut flora is something that you should be aware of, because I think that the number of passages on that are going to start to probably increase in the next couple of years.
All I'm wanting is more CRISPR-Cas9 passages.
Yeah.
Bring them on. Come on. Such a good opportunity to test so many really important concepts.
Right.
Give it to me. Come on.
Yeah. And so I think that this is also something that you should be, this is a very meta, very big picture discussion, like going through this. But when you are like, let's say you're trying to work on your comfort with certain topics, don't go and look for a bunch of like research articles and journal articles that are like 30 or 40 years old, because those probably are not the things that the AMC wants to use. There are some students that if their problem is data interpretation, they just struggle reading like those avalanche of jargon passages. Sometimes I'll recommend to a student, just read some research articles, like go check out a copy of Nature or Science. And what might be smart in that case is check out one from 5 years ago or 6 years ago or 7 years ago, because that tends to be kind of where the information comes from. I know people might be watching this podcast in the future, but I think that like respiratory illnesses and particular viruses, aka COVID, you will probably likely see some AAMC like MCAT passages on those in the coming years, just because it's a hot area of research and so many researchers went into that field, like trying to figure out how to kind of like work on the problems that the world was facing. So as a result, that's going to cause like repercussions and echoes in what's going to be tested on the MCAT in the future, which is interesting.
Yep. I feel like the big take home here is get as much exposure as you can, because like we've been saying,
not to disease or COVID, but exposure.
Careful about your exposure to the things you're reading about in passages while you get exposed to the passages. Yeah. The key things to take home from this is trust in your ability to know and learn biology. I know that a lot of us consider ourselves experts. Know that, one, there's always room for improvement, and two, this section will test a lot more than your knowledge and your understanding, and be ready for that, right? Reach out for help if you are recognizing that, when you take the content diagnostic on our website for biochem, every piece of your content, but you are still not seeing the improvements that you need. It's probably something else, right? It's probably data interpretation. It's probably dealing with the actual passage. Maybe it's endurance, maybe it's timing, right? Reach out. You can contact our academic advisors. They'll meet with you for free, right? Talk about what resources you might need, right? Mm-hmm. Reach out and try and look for the consistent themes that you will see in passages, and what kind of skills are needed to actually get those questions right? Looking for consistency in your own, read-throughs is really key, but it's also looking for any strengths and weaknesses that show up again and again, right? Collect data on yourself to give you an idea of where you need to go next. Really, really crucial.
Yeah, I think I feel like there's always more to say, but I think that it kind of makes sense as like a stopping point. And I do want to reiterate everything you said. If you students, if you guys have more questions about the MCAT or about the process, I do want you guys to know you can reach out to the academic advisors, but also stuff past that. If you are you feel like, okay, the podcast has helped me, I've got the MCAT down now. I want to get the exact score that I'm looking for. If you have any questions about making personal statements or your secondaries or scholarships to medical school or working on your interviews, I just want students to know that there are resources a little bit beyond just the MCAT. And like I said, it doesn't cost anything to talk to an academic advisor. They can kind of point you in the direction of some resources and give you some advice to help you out and kind of start to make that journey successfully to becoming a physician. And then you'll start to deal with some of the other things that we're talking about. Fast forward 10 years from now, you'll be talking to all of your friends from med school and be like, hey, did you read that research article and see what's going on with this thing?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's so many things that we can help you here with. It's really kind of the thing that connects all of us here at Jack Westin, is just wanting you guys to have the support and the resources that you need to go on and succeed, no matter where it is. The last thing that I will say is, before you're ready to do admissions, if you have any issues specifically with biochem, you need some help, you need some support, come hang out with me in biochem office hours. When you chat with an academic advisor, right, they will also be able to hook you up with a 5-day free trial of the course, right? Definitely in that period, come see me in a class. Let's chat, right? Let's figure out what your weak areas are. Let's talk about how to address them, right? You really do get a lot of one-on-one help in the course, whether you're trying it for free or whether you're actually a course student. So come hang out with me. I do it all the time. All of our instructors are here waiting to give you some help. And Phil does office hours as well. So plug retroactively from last
plug
Chem Phys discussion.